President Trump not backing down from his push to take over Greenland, citing security concerns and criticizing Denmark's inability to protect the Arctic territory.
Trump wrapped up a nearly 2-hour-long briefing at the White House last hour, doubling down on his demands to own Greenland.
We need it for strategic national security and international security. This enormous unsecured island is actually part of North America.
You've heard the headline, Trump wants Greenland, but if you think this is just a weird headline for clicks, you're missing what actually happened at Davos. Because on January 23rd, 2026, at the World Economic Forum, Trump didn't quietly float the idea. He reignited it publicly on the biggest global stage available. He said he won't use military force to acquire Greenland, but he also argued the U.S. should be the one to secure it and pressed for negotiations. That combination, no force, say we must have it, is exactly how geopolitical pressure is packaged before it becomes policy. Here's the core of the story. Greenland is an autonomous territory within the Kingdom of Denmark, and Trump's renewed push immediately triggered pushback from allies and sparked fresh tension across the transatlantic relationship. Now, why Greenland? Because Greenland isn't just land, it's position. A strategic Arctic platform, important for surveillance, logistics, and the new competition emerging in the far north as climate and shipping realities shift. And here's the part people miss. Trump didn't just talk about Greenland. He used Greenland to test something bigger, how far allies will bend under pressure. Reports describe a tough reception at Davos and wider concern that pushing a NATO ally on territory strains trust inside the alliance, even if no shot is fired. So what happens next? There are three likely paths. 1. Access without ownership. More U.S. basing, more radar, more Arctic cooperation sold as a compromise, while Denmark and Greenland keep formal sovereignty. 2. The pressure campaign diplomatic heat, public messaging, and economic leverage, turning negotiations into a standing demand until resistance becomes politically expensive. 3. Alliance stress fracture. If this escalates, the larger story becomes NATO trust and U.S.-Europe relations, because territorial pressure inside an alliance is a taboo with long-term consequences. Final thought, Greenland is the headline, but the deeper story is the method, strategic geography plus public pressure plus alliance stress testing. So don't treat Greenland like a meme. Watch what happens next, what Denmark signals, what NATO leaders say, and whether Trump converts this from a headline into a doctrine. And here's where the story gets sharper, because Davos wasn't just a venue, it was a message amplifier. Trump didn't raise Greenland in a bilateral meeting with Denmark. He raised it in front of global capital, CEOs, investors, energy firms, defense contractors, and political leaders who shape long-term strategy. That choice matters. At Davos, ideas don't stay theoretical. They get priced in. When a U.S. president signals that Greenland is a strategic priority, markets immediately start asking questions. Who controls Arctic logistics? Who benefits from future shipping routes? Who gets preferential access to rare earths, energy corridors, and military infrastructure? This is how power shifts without treaties. And make no mistake, Greenland sits at the intersection of all of it. The Arctic is opening, ice is retreating, shipping lanes are shortening, military planners are redrawing maps that were frozen for decades. Whoever dominates the Arctic controls the northern gateway between North America, Europe, and Asia. That's the real subtext of Trump's words. Now look at the framing. Trump didn't say annexation. He didn't say purchase outright. He said security. Security is the most flexible justification in geopolitics. It allows pressure without admitting aggression. It turns resistance into irresponsibility. If the U.S. frames Greenland as a security necessity, then any opposition by Denmark, by Europe, even by Greenland itself, can be painted as endangering collective safety. That's not accidental. That's strategic language. And this is why European leaders reacted so sharply, because Europe understands where this road leads. If territory inside an alliance becomes negotiable based on strategic need, then no border is entirely safe from reinterpretation. Today it's Greenland, tomorrow it's basing rights, airspace control, energy infrastructure, or Arctic governance itself. This is why the pushback wasn't loud, but it was firm. Another critical detail most people missed. Trump explicitly tied Greenland to America's role in NATO, suggesting that the alliance itself should accommodate U.S. control. That flips the post-war logic on its head. NATO was built on mutual defense, not mutual surrender. And once that line blurs, the alliance stops being a shield and starts becoming leverage. Now zoom out. This Greenland push fits a broader pattern in Trump's foreign policy. Everything becomes transactional. Protection has a price. Security comes with conditions. In that world, alliances aren't permanent, they're negotiable. Territory isn't sacred, it's strategic. And diplomacy isn't persuasion, it's pressure management. That's why this moment matters far beyond the Arctic, because it signals a shift from rules-based influence to deal-based dominance. And here's the uncomfortable truth. For many actors in the room at Davos, that message wasn't shocking. It was clarifying. They now know how to read the map. So the real question isn't whether Trump will take Greenland. The real question is whether this approach becomes normalized. If it does, the international system moves into a new phase, one where power openly rewrites expectations and sovereignty becomes conditional on strategic usefulness. That's why this story isn't over. It's just entered its next chapter. Watch the follow-up statements. Watch the quiet negotiations. Watch how often Greenland comes up, not as a joke, not as a headline, but as an assumption. Because once something is framed as inevitable, resistance becomes the anomaly. And in geopolitics, inevitability is often the most powerful weapon of all. And here's the layer beneath that, where this stops being about Greenland entirely. Because when Trump speaks this way, he's not just talking to Denmark or Europe. He's talking to every state that sits on strategically valuable ground. The message is simple and unsettling. Geography now comes with conditions. If you sit on land that matters for American security, trade routes, energy flows, or military posture, your sovereignty is no longer just a legal fact. It's a negotiating variable. That's the psychological shift Davos exposed. This is why Trump emphasized that he won't use force. Not because force is off the table forever, but because force isn't necessary yet. Pressure works better when it's deniable, when it's gradual, when it arrives wrapped in the language of responsibility, partnership, and global stability. And Greenland is the perfect test case. It's strategically vital, it's sparsely populated, it relies on external security guarantees, and it sits inside an alliance structure dominated by the United States. If pressure works here, even partially, it becomes a template. Now think about who's watching closely. Not just Europe, not just NATO. China is watching. Russia is watching. Every mid-sized power that relies on geography as leverage is watching. Because this isn't an Arctic story, it's a precedent story. If strategic necessity can override political consent inside an alliance, then international norms aren't eroding. They're being rewritten in real time, and rewriting norms doesn't happen with declarations. It happens with repetition. Each time the idea is restated, it becomes less shocking. Each time it's debated, it becomes more legitimate. Each time it's framed as inevitable, resistance weakens. That's how power shifts without a single treaty being signed. This is also why Trump chose Davos instead of Washington. In Washington, this would have been partisan noise. At Davos, it becomes a signal to capital, industry, and strategic planners. And capital adjusts faster than governments. Once investors start treating Greenland as a future U.S.-aligned asset, once defense planners start modeling it as an American-controlled node, the political debate lags behind reality. Politics always follows economics and security planning, never the other way around. Now, here's the irony. Trump presents this as strength, but it also exposes vulnerability because you only pressure allies this way when you're worried about losing strategic ground. The Arctic is heating up, not just physically, but competitively. Shipping lanes are shifting, resource access is tightening, military balance is moving north. Greenland isn't being targeted because America is confident. It's being targeted because America doesn't want to be surprised later. That urgency is the tell. So when Trump says this is about security, what he really means is control of future uncertainty. And that's the dangerous part, because when great powers start acting preemptively to lock down geography, diplomacy narrows, choices harden, misunderstandings multiply. Europe now has to calculate something it hasn't seriously confronted in decades. What happens when the biggest threat to alliance cohesion doesn't come from outside, but from inside? Denmark is trapped between sovereignty and security dependence. Greenland is trapped between self-determination and strategic value, and NATO is trapped between unity and hierarchy. None of those traps have clean exits. That's why this moment matters. Not because Greenland will change hands tomorrow, but because the rules around asking have changed. And once the rules change, the world doesn't go back. So don't watch this story for a final announcement. Watch it for normalization, for repetition, for silence. Because the most important shifts in geopolitics don't arrive with tanks or treaties. They arrive when everyone quietly starts planning as if the outcome is already decided. And here's where the consequences start to spread outward. Because once a major power treats allied territory as negotiable, every smaller state starts reevaluating its assumptions. The old guarantee that alliances protect sovereignty by default begins to feel conditional. That creates fear, but it also creates behavior. Some countries will respond by getting closer to Washington, hoping proximity buys protection. Others will quietly hedge, opening back channels to alternative powers, diversifying security ties, or accelerating domestic defense planning. And some will do the most dangerous thing of all, stay silent, hoping the storm passes. Silence is often mistaken for consent. This is why Greenland's own position is so precarious. It isn't just Denmark's problem. Greenland's leadership has long spoken about greater autonomy, even eventual independence. But independence in a world where great powers openly compete over geography is not freedom. It's exposure. Suddenly, every internal debate inside Greenland becomes external leverage. Every economic vulnerability becomes strategic pressure. Every security gap becomes someone else's justification. That's how sovereignty erodes, not through invasion, but through dependency. And Trump understands this dynamic intuitively. He doesn't need to redraw borders. He just needs to redraw expectations. Once allies accept that American security priorities override political discomfort, the negotiation space collapses. What remains is timing, optics, and sequencing, not principle. This is also why the phrase "won't use force" is so misleading. Force isn't just military. Force is economic isolation. Force is intelligence leverage. Force is security conditionality. If air defense cooperation, intelligence sharing, or Arctic patrols quietly become contingent on alignment, the outcome can be shaped without a single formal demand. That's how modern power works, and this is where the Arctic becomes the proving ground for a wider shift. If this model works in Greenland, it doesn't stay in the Arctic. It moves south, east, and west. It becomes relevant to island chains, energy choke points, space infrastructure, undersea cables, anywhere geography intersects with power. That's why this moment matters to countries far from Greenland, because the principle being tested is universal. Does strategic value weaken political consent? For decades, the international system tried to pretend the answer was no. Trump is openly suggesting the answer is yes. And once that idea is on the table, it doesn't disappear with one administration or one headline. The pressure will now shift into quieter spaces, closed-door meetings, defense planning documents, budget reallocations, infrastructure proposals framed as joint security initiatives. The public debate will cool. The private negotiations will intensify. That's always the pattern. So if you're waiting for a dramatic follow-up, an ultimatum, a treaty, a crisis, you may be waiting a long time. This story won't climax loudly. It will resolve quietly through assumptions, through planning, through actions taken as if the outcome is already settled. And that's the most dangerous kind of power shift, the kind that happens while everyone is still arguing about whether it's real. Greenland is not the prize, it's the signal, a signal that the era of comfortable alliances, where power politely pretended to respect limits, is fading. What replaces it is colder, sharper, and far more honest. A world where geography is destiny again, and where being strategically important no longer guarantees protection, but invites pressure. That is the world being previewed here. And once you see it that way, you realize this story hasn't peaked yet. It's only just beginning. So this is where the story rests, for now. Not with an announcement, not with a treaty, not with a confrontation, but with a shift in tone. Greenland didn't change hands, borders didn't move, but something far more important did. The assumptions underneath the global system. For decades, alliances were built on the idea that sovereignty was non-negotiable and security was shared. What Davos revealed is that those ideas are now conditional, subject to strategic value and power imbalance. That's the real legacy of this moment, because once great powers start speaking this way in public, smaller nations stop believing in guarantees and start preparing for pressure. Greenland is watching, Denmark is calculating, Europe is reassessing, and rivals are taking notes. This isn't about whether Trump gets Greenland. It's about whether this method becomes normal. If it does, the world doesn't slide into chaos overnight. It becomes colder, more transactional, less forgiving, a world where geography matters more than promises and power speaks louder than partnership. So when this story fades from headlines, don't assume it's over. Assume it's moved underground, into planning rooms, defense papers, and quiet negotiations that never make the news. Because the most important geopolitical shifts don't end with applause or outrage. They end with acceptance. And once acceptance sets in, the outcome is already decided. That's the real danger and the real signal behind Trump's Greenland push.